Ghosts, spirits, seances. What do you think of when you think of talking to the dead? Maybe a movie with a dramatic seance like this. Or maybe Noel Coward's play, Blythe's Spirit, with Angela Lansbury as Madame Arcady summoning the dead. Today, we roll our eyes when we talk about seances. We think it's laughable, but it wasn't always so. Modern spiritualism dates to 1848. Now, spiritualism, simply put, is a belief system that holds that the spirits of the dead residing in a spirit world want to communicate with the living with the help of a medium or a go-between who would hold a seance where the spirits would be summoned. The word seance is from the French word for session, from the old French word seoir, to sit. I first became interested in spiritualism in graduate school. I read 19th century American ghost stories, which I enjoyed. And when I had the opportunity to take over the spiritualism tour at Laurel Hill, I jumped on it. Happy to talk about Laurel Hill after the talk if anybody's interested in events there. But I will say that some of the founders and early members of Science and Art are buried there. To begin, I want to give you the historical and religious context and underpinnings of spiritualism that combined to make 19th century America such fertile grounds for it. Second, I want to share the story of the first mediums, the Fox sisters. And third, I want to explore the growth of spiritualism, particularly here in Philadelphia, but also abroad, trace offshoots in the 20th century, and describe spiritualist practices that are still with us today. We should see spiritualism as part of the springing up of different belief systems, both religious and secular, in the 19th century. Modern spiritualism got its start in upstate New York in a village called Hydesville in Wayne County. Now, Western and Central New York, in particular, were marked by the religious fervor of revivals by visiting preachers, the theological descendants of Jonathan Edwards, whose famous sermon was, "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God." This focus on hell and damnation had competition from other new mid-19th century religions, and in general, there was a democratization of religion during this period. As you will see, spiritualism asserts that each individual could have direct knowledge of the truth directly through spiritual communication. Western New York became a hotbed of new religions, among them Mormonism. Joseph Smith was living there and claimed to have discovered golden tablets on a hilltop near his home, which contained new revelations. The Book of Mormon was first published in Wayne County. That same area produced Seventh-day Adventists, originally called Millerites. There were also European antecedents of spiritualism. Mesmerism was well known in America by the 1840s. It was named for the Viennese doctor Franz Anton Mesmer, who laid the foundations for hypnotism. Mesmer cured ill patients by putting them in a trance. He moved to Paris and gave demonstrations. Audiences would gather in a dimly lit room and Mesmer would hypnotize the patient. Audience members would be charged a fee. Dark rooms and admissions charges were both adopted by spiritualists. We can also see the roots of spiritualism in Swedenborgianism. Emanuel Swedenborg was an 18th century philosopher and mystic, the founder of the Church of the New Jerusalem, American headquarters very nearby in Bryn Athyn, Pennsylvania. Swedenborg believed that at death, everyone went to the spirit world before ascending into heaven or descending into hell. And this belief in the spirit world becomes part of spiritualism. Now back to upstate New York, to Hydesville. That little star is where Hydesville is, where we meet two of the most important figures in spiritualism, the Fox sisters, Maggie and Kate. They were the two youngest children of a blacksmith and farmer and his wife. They were living in a rental house until the house they were building nearby could be finished. The 14-year-old Maggie and the 11-year-old Kate had only received rudimentary schooling, but they were bright and mischievous. The rental house probably had old house sounds. What old house doesn't have old house sounds, particularly after dark? One night after the Foxes had lived in the house for about 3 months, the girls went to bed, but soon shouted for their mother. Something, they said, was making knocking sounds. Now, the mother didn't consider that the daughters might be making the sounds in some way, or might be pulling a prank on their gullible and superstitious mother. Now, this went on for several nights. The parents noted that the sounds only happened when the daughters were nearby and ended once they fell asleep. That might suggest that the daughters were responsible for the raps. Or, and this is what the mother thought, perhaps there was a spirit that required the girls' presence. One night, Kate asked the spirit questions. She clapped twice, and there were 2 knocks. Then Kate held up 2 fingers. There were 2 raps. Look, said Kate, it can see as well as hear. They began to ask it questions. The mother asked, how many children did she have? 6, said the spirit. But I only had 5, said Mrs. Fox. Ah, but you had a baby who died in infancy, said the girls. This was all too much. The mother told the neighbors who came over the next night. Now, not wanting to embarrass the parents, the girls repeated the knocking for the neighbors, who were also taken in. The spirit said he was a peddler who 4 years earlier, when he was 31 years of age, was robbed and murdered by the then occupant of the house by having his throat cut, and that he had $500 stolen from him, and that he was buried in the basement. Now, men went to the basement and dug to try to find the body, but they struck water, so they had to stop digging. Over the next few days, the neighbors posed their own questions. Is there a heaven? Is my child Mary in heaven? Are the spirits of our departed friends around us? Yes, was the answer to all the questions. Now, what does that sound like? The tapping sounds of Samuel Morse's telegraph. The debut of the telegraph line between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore had occurred in 1844, 4 years before. The inaugural message was, "What hath God wrought?" The telegraph spread rapidly, beginning in 1845, and by 1850, there were 12,000 miles of telegraph lines. Morse encoded the 26 letters of the alphabet using dots and dashes, or 2 different signal durations. So you can understand the connection there. Word spread of the Fox sisters. A journalist wrote a 40-page pamphlet entitled "A Report of the Mysterious Noises Heard in the Home of Mr. John D. Fox in Hydesville, Wayne County, authenticated by the certificates and confirmed by the statements of the citizens of that place and vicinity." Frightened by the rapping, the mother took her children to Rochester, where her oldest daughter, Leah Fox Fish, was living. Leah was a single parent who taught piano lessons to support herself and her daughter. And Leah observed the spirit rapping, and she too invited friends to attend a session. But her response was not fear. Leah smelled money. She started inviting people to her home. Her friends were Quakers, reformers, abolitionists. In fact, Western New York was a hotbed of social revolution and free thought, and Rochester was a particularly progressive area. Frederick Douglass published the abolitionist newspaper, The North Star, in Rochester. The Seneca Falls Convention, the first women's rights convention, was held nearby just 3 months after the first spirit raps were heard. A few years later, and not too far away, was the Oneida Utopian community. Leah's friends, 19th century disruptors, were open to new ideas. They spread the word about the seances led by the Foxes. In fact, the movement became known as attracting radical socialists, anti-slavery activists, and women's rights proponents. Not all feminists were spiritualists, but one scholar says that all spiritualists advocated for women's rights. Quote, raps reportedly rocked the same table where Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton penned the Seneca Rights Convention agenda. After months of smaller gatherings at her home or the home of friends, Leah hired Rochester's largest hall with a capacity for 1,200. She filled it and charged people 25 cents a head to attend this large seance. A prominent citizen began the evening telling the story of the Fox girls in Hydesville. He compared their discovery of the spirits to those of Galileo, Newton, and Fulton. The link to science is notable. That evening, the Foxes conducted a seance. The audience asked questions, they were answered, and they left to applause, but also a few jeers. They returned for 2 more nights, and their fame spread. After these large gatherings, Leah took her sisters on the road and ultimately became a medium herself. Buffalo, Cleveland, Albany, they visited them all. And here, that's Seneca Falls. There are the 3 sisters with Leah, the oldest one. In these cities and in Rochester, they were examined by doctors and other leading citizens trying to find an explanation for the knocks. But by this time, the sisters had become adept. It could not be proven that the spirits were making the noises, but it also couldn't be proven that the Fox sisters were doing it either. Although one clever examiner wondered if they weren't cracking their joints, particularly their toe joints. Maggie and Kate Fox moved to New York City. Their sessions were covered by Horace Greeley in the New York Tribune and by other journalists. Among those who attended their public seances were Greeley himself, James Fenimore Cooper, Sojourner Truth, and William Lloyd Garrison. They earned a good living as mediums, and others quickly followed their lead. Showmanship became an increasingly important part of spiritualism. There were mediums who caused tables to levitate, musical instruments to play, apparitions to materialize. Now, let's stop for a second. Why would the ability to communicate with one's dead loved ones be attractive in mid-19th century America? Perhaps shorter life expectancy? Perhaps a high rate of infant and child mortality? Mary Todd Lincoln organized seances in the White House, trying to summon the spirit of her little son Willie, who died at 11 in 1862. Abraham Lincoln himself was reported to have attended one of the seances. Most importantly, though, was the incredible loss of life in the Civil War. 600,000 died in battle, and they were typically buried near where they fell. So their bodies couldn't be shipped home, which might have provided a sense of closure to their grieving families. So the bereaved were drawn to spiritualism because they wanted to communicate with the mainly young men, their sons, their fathers, brothers. There was also a desire to imagine an afterlife more pleasant than a Calvinist place of infinite torment. Finally, Victorians, American Victorians, as well as British, liked to investigate things. They liked trying to prove that spiritualists were fakers, charlatans out to make a buck. Of course, the skeptics had to fork over their money to attend to seance as well, adding to the medium's earnings. For a combination of reasons, spiritualism caught on. By 1855, it was estimated that there were 3 million spiritualists nationwide. That's 7 years after the first draps, out of a population of around 30 million. In the 1860s alone, following the Civil War, there were 2 million new adherents. By 1852, spiritualism had spread to England, where an American medium began holding seances. Soon there were dozens of mediums working in England. Spiritualist newspapers were published on both sides of the Atlantic. One of the best known, and here's my slide finally, Banner of Light, was published in Boston, and it lasted from 1857 to 1907. All told, over 75 spiritualist newspapers and periodicals were published in the U.S. during the latter half of the 19th century. These publications played an important role in the spread of spiritualism, as there was no centralized organization. The periodicals linked isolated believers across the country, and as mediums were frequently itinerant, announced upcoming seances and gatherings. Philadelphia was swept up in spiritualism relatively quickly. Spiritualist associations were formed in the 1850s. In 1851, there were over 50 spirit circles meeting in Philadelphia, most led by women mediums. Mediumship was, in fact, a new profession for women, of which there weren't that many in mid-19th century America. In 1855, Emerson placed the profession of medium in the same category as railroad man, landscape art gardener, lecturer, and daguerreotypist. All were careers newly minted at that time. Seances frequently took place in the home, and if a larger space were required, a hall or a ballroom at a hotel could be rented. But there were some church-like structures. In fact, Philadelphia had at least 3. The First Association, the Keystone Association, and the Second Association of Spiritualists, the only one with a building in Fishtown. Today's Fishtown. The Second Association continued to meet in that building until 1956, when they sold it to a Baptist church. And it still meets today in a ramshackle Victorian row house at 421 North Preston Street in West Philadelphia. A plaque and sign adorn the facade stating, "This is the Celestial Spiritualist Church." The sign says, "This is the Celestial Spiritualist Church with services on Sundays and Wednesdays. All are welcome." And when I gave my tour one time, there was a congregant from that church who was there, or that association. I now want to mention a prominent Philadelphian, Robert Hare. He was a professor of chemistry at Penn and an inventor. In 1853, when he was 72, he was a spiritualist skeptic, and he determined to conduct a series of experiments with mediums. As a scientist, Hare felt if he were a good observer in the laboratory, he was qualified to observe at a seance. Whether it was his advanced age or his gullibility, we don't know, but he was unable to spot deception, so he became a believer. And in 1854, he published Spiritualism Scientifically Demonstrated. Hare was ridiculed by his scientific community, and he died in 1858. But I mention him partly because as part of the experiments, he devised something he called a psychograph, an early Ouija board, complete with a planchette, the little thing you put your fingers on and move about. He wanted to speed up the spelling out of spirit messages. I'll return to Ouija boards in a little bit. I also mention here precisely because he was a scientist. The Victorian desire to investigate can be attributed to the rise of science. The word scientist was just coming into popular use in the mid-19th century as an umbrella term for all scientific disciplines: chemistry, biology, geology, physics. What unites them all is the scientific method, which, as you all know as members of science and art, is an empirical approach to acquiring knowledge. It involves forming a hypothesis, testing or experimenting with careful observation, applying rigorous skepticism about what is observed, given that cognitive assumptions can distort how one interprets the observation, and in light of the results, confirm, reject, or retest the hypothesis. Spiritualism was investigated almost as soon as the first rappings were heard. Back to the Fox sisters. They had moved to New York, and here they are at relatively young age. They were very active, offering public seances 3 times a day and private sessions in between. Their fame continued to grow. When Jenny Lind came to New York in 1850, the person she most wanted to meet was Maggie Fox. And the Fox sisters continued to travel to other cities. When Maggie was in Washington, D.C. to conduct seances, she was summoned by the new First Lady, Mrs. Franklin Pierce, whose young son had been killed in a train crash before her eyes in early 1853. In 1852, the 19-year-old Maggie Fox was offering seances in Philadelphia at a hotel, and among the attendees was the 32-year-old Dr. Elisha Kent Kane, one of the most famous men in antebellum America. How many people have heard of Elisha Kent Kane? Yay! One person. I'm going to talk about him. I'm going to digress just for a moment because he really was famous. He was born in 1820 to a prominent family. In his teens, he got rheumatic fever, damaged his heart. He was told he wasn't going to have a long life, and so he decided to live life to the fullest. And among his exploits, he traveled in Asia and Africa. He had himself lowered down an active volcano in the Philippines in order to get a sample of sulfur. He was appointed by the Secretary of State to carry a secret message to General Winfield Scott in the Mexican-American War, which he did. While there, he engaged in a lance and saber battle with the Mexicans, and he was wounded, and he sewed himself up. And all of the things he did. Did I mention that he went to Penn Medical School? He went to Penn Medical School. He graduated near the top of his class. That's why he was sewing himself up. And he would write letters to his brother with the idea, they sort of colluded, that the brother would write about him for the newspapers. When he met Maggie, he had recently returned from an Arctic expedition. And it was the expedition was searching for a missing British explorer. They didn't find him. Kane came back to Philadelphia and wrote a book. And then he started lecturing about the Arctic. And he went around and he charged a fee because he wanted to raise money for another expedition. And he became extremely well known. He did not believe in spiritualism, but he became infatuated with Maggie. At the first sight of her, he was struck by her aura of mystery and her paradoxical double nature. Quote, that strange mixture of child and woman, of simplicity and cunning, passionate impulse, and extreme self-control, unquote. So they began courting. He told her he felt spiritualism was vulgar. Seances were seen as scandalous, meeting in dimly lit rooms in mixed company, holding hands, mixing with the public. He began begging her to give it all up. He knew his family would disapprove of an alliance with a medium. And her family wasn't too happy about it either because they didn't want to break up the act, if you will. By early 1853, he declared his love, but he insisted on keeping it a secret, which frustrated Maggie. He's alleged to have proposed to her on the condition that she give up seances. In fact, she was exhausted from her work, and she did give them up for a time. Kane went back to the Arctic in 1853. He and his men lived through 2 Arctic winters. He didn't find the missing explorer, but he did lay down a route to the North Pole, an ice-free corridor, which was followed decades later by Robert Peary. And Robert Peary spoke to science and art early in the 20th century. In any case, he and his men made a harrowing escape from the Arctic. They walked over 1,000 miles in ice and snow, very cold temperatures, and his return was front page news. He and Maggie returned their private engagement. Kane immediately set about writing a book about this second expedition with engravings based on his sketches. I believe this is one of his sketches. He felt sure the book would provide a means of support independent of his family. He needed this family was essentially supporting his life of adventure, and he needed to be able to support himself. Rumors persisted that Kane and Maggie were engaged. It's important to note that celebrity was a new invention, created perhaps by the many newspapers that needed copy. Kane and Maggie were perhaps America's first power couple. The rigors of 2 years in the Arctic, near starvation, temperatures at 60 below zero, affected Kane's fragile health. He was advised to go to a warm climate to recuperate after he finished his book. And before leaving, he decided to go to Cuba. He and Maggie, in front of her mother and a few friends, gave impromptu vows, a sort of self-uniting marriage ceremony. Kane promised to marry Maggie in a church when he came back. Alas, his condition worsened in Cuba, and he died in February 1857 at the age of 37. Kane was seen as a tragic hero cut down in his prime. There was such grief that a new phenomenon was created, the multi-city funeral tour. The governor general of Cuba escorted the body to New Orleans. It was loaded on a steamboat. It went up the Mississippi River and then the Ohio River, stopping along the way for people to pay their respects. Then loaded onto a train to Baltimore and then Philadelphia, where he lay in state at Independence Hall. It was the second largest 19th century funeral after Lincoln's. In fact, Lincoln's funeral procession was modeled after Kane's. Maggie Fox approached Kane's family, revealed they had been secretly married, and asked for a share of his estate, which by this time had grown considerably because his book was published posthumously, and it sold in the first year 65,000 copies, more than any book published except the Bible. The family essentially resisted this entreaty. She sued, but the case was dismissed. Yet she began calling herself Mrs. Kane. Finally, 9 years after his death and in need of funds, she published her own book, The Love Life of Dr. Kane, perhaps the first celebrity tell-all. The full title, containing the correspondence and a history of the acquaintance and secret marriage between Elisha K. Kane and Margaret Fox, by anonymous. But the timing was bad. Published in 1866, just after the Civil War, it didn't sell well. Maggie had by this point returned to her work as a medium and continued doing so for some years. We'll come back to her again. Attempts to prove or disprove spiritualism continued. The most famous such undertaking was started by a Philadelphian, Henry Siebert. He was born in 1801. His mother died in childbirth. He was very close to his father, but the father died when he was 24. The father had been a chemist and a congressman, and he left Henry a fortune. Henry didn't have to work and lived a modest life. I could find no image, no picture of Henry Siebert, which is pretty amazing because he was a member of the American Philosophical Society. I mean, he He was a person that you would think somebody might have painted a portrait of, but they didn't. He was affected by the loss of his mother. He never knew her, and the death of his father, and he yearned to communicate with them. So he was drawn to spiritualism, and he became an ardent believer. In 1878, he turned his own home into a spiritual mansion with nightly seances, and he invited, guess who, the famous Maggie Fox, to move in and become medium in residence. This she did, but she was worn out by Siebert, who wanted her to summon the spirits of historical persons and biblical figures, the prophet Elijah, the saints Peter and Paul, the angel Gabriel, to name just a few. Exhausted from these demands, she left Siebert and returned to New York. At his death in 1883, Siebert left money to charity, established a foundation that still exists, and gave $60,000 to endow a chair in philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania, with the stipulation that a commission be set up by Penn to investigate, quote, all systems of morals, religion, or philosophy which assume to represent the truth, and particularly of modern spiritualism. And he left an additional $20,000 to fund the work of the commission. So that's $80,000, which, you know, was a lot of money back then. 2 years earlier, Joseph Wharton had given $100,000 to create a whole business school at Penn. So this is a good gift. The Siebert Commission was an impressive and genuine effort by Penn to fulfill this mandate. Its leader, Horace Howard Furness, there he is, was born in 1833. He was trained as a lawyer, but he had severe hearing loss and he couldn't keep up with the proceedings in court. So he changed careers and became the preeminent Shakespeare scholar of his time. He lectured at Penn, served as a Penn trustee, and the Furness Library, designed by his brother, the acclaimed architect Frank Furness, was named for him. In addition to Furness, Penn appointed powerhouse commissioners. Members were the university's provost. At a time when there was no president, the provost ran the place. William Pepper, he was a cousin by marriage of Siebert's and was the founder of the Free Library of Philadelphia and a co-founder of the Penn Museum. Other members included several of Penn's most distinguished professors and leading citizens, such as, there's William Pepper, S. Weir Mitchell, Silas Weir Mitchell, author and father of medical neurology and a pioneer of evidence-based medicine. And Coleman Sellers, the electrical engineer who designed the hydroelectric plant at Niagara Falls. Many of the commissioners were scientists. Over 3 years, they attended many seances, both in Philadelphia and in New York and as far away as Germany. In their preliminary report to the Penn trustees, they stressed they were open-minded as they explored all facets of spiritualism and were always courteous to the mediums, the best known of the day. They would frequently attend these sessions alone so as not to attract suspicion, although Furness, with his ear trumpet, here's a picture of Furness, with his grandson, that was his ear trumpet. He was a marked man after a while, and the spirits would not appear when he was present. The commission report has numerous descriptions of spirit rapping or knocking, which they believe came from the cracking of knuckles, knees, or toes. There was independent slate writing, conveniently under a table where slates could be exchanged for others that already had been written upon. And there were materializing seances where the spirit of the departed would emerge from a cabinet. Furness himself said he attended 20 to 30 of these seances. The room, he reported, was always dark. The attendees were frequently regulars, quote, whose lives have been clouded by sorrow, unquote. And they sat closest to the medium. The spirit would emerge from the cabinet, always looking suspiciously like the medium, according to Furness, who was one time visited by the spirit of his father, who was very much alive, and by a niece named Effie, who did not exist. It is inevitable that the commission would invite Maggie Fox to lead a seance for them. At first she declined, but they persisted, and she finally agreed, traveling from New York to Furness's townhouse on West Washington Square in November 1884. She produced raps which she said were from the spirit of Henry Siebert himself. How, they asked, could they be sure she was not making the sounds herself, as they had heard she had produced them by cracking her toes? She offered to stand on water glasses, thus separating her feet from the floor below. Furness asked permission to touch Maggie's feet, and she agreed. There were more raps. Furness is recorded by the stenographer as saying, quote, "This is the most wonderful thing of all, Mrs. Kane. I distinctly feel them in your foot. There is not a particle of motion in your foot, but there is an unusual pulsation," unquote. Maggie was invited back for another session, but she declined. In 1887, the commission issued their preliminary report. There it is. They could find no proof that spiritualism was anything but trickery. There never was a final report. In the 1880s, Maggie Fox admitted spiritualism was all a trick, and she gave presentations to demonstrate how she fooled people, for a fee, of course. Then she recanted and went back to holding seances. In 1893, not yet 60 and suffering from alcoholism, she died destitute and is buried in Brooklyn. As I wrap up, I want to say a word about Ouija boards, the commercialized version of the psychograph planchette. In the 1880s, people were impatient with the laborious calling out of the letters of the alphabet with raps for the correct letter. They wanted to speed things up. An article in 1886 reported that the planchette was being used by spiritualist camps in Ohio. Shortly thereafter, Charles Kennard of Baltimore began manufacturing them commercially. He incorporated in 1890 and received a patent for the Ouija board in 1891. It was a hit, marketed as both a mystical oracle and a family entertainment. About the only people who didn't like Ouija boards were mediums, because they were eliminating the middleman or middlewoman. By 1892, the Kennard Company had 6 factories here and 1 in England. The game remained popular throughout the 20th century. How many people here played with a Ouija board? Yeah. In 1967, the year Parker Brothers bought the game from the original company, 2 million boards were sold, outselling Monopoly. And you can still buy a Ouija board today, right on Amazon. By the late 19th century, interest in spiritualism declined. We can guess at the reasons why. First, life expectancy increased. Infant mortality rates dropped after 1880 because of improved public health measures and preventative care. There were a few more career opportunities for women. The invention of electric lights banished shadows from the seance rooms. There was another surge of interest in England after World War I. 700,000 British soldiers were killed. Among them was a son of Arthur Conan Doyle, who started investigating spiritualism as early as 1887. He wrote an article that year declaring he was a spiritualist. His belief strengthened after his son's death. He called spiritualism the new revelation, sent by God to bring solace to the bereaved. He published a 2-volume history of spiritualism. Let's see if I have his book. Yes. In 1926. And he had harsh words for the University of Pennsylvania. Quote, "There is no doubt that the report of the Siebert Commission set back the cause of psychic truth, yet the real harm fell upon the learned institution which these gentlemen represented," unquote. One of Doyle's friends, Harry Houdini, was also interested in spiritualism. After his mother's death, he began to attend seances in order to communicate with her. But with his knowledge of magicians' tricks and sleight of hand, he quickly saw that spiritualism was trickery. Houdini took to attending seances in disguise, and his fame as a medium buster grew. He summarized his exploits in a book. Can you read it? A Magician Among the Spirits, in 1924, which ruptured his friendship with Doyle. In this country, spiritualism lives on today. Where else but upstate New York? See the little star there. At Lilydale, a summer retreat founded by spiritualists in 1870 between Buffalo and Erie. There's the entrance to Lilydale. The little house in Hydesville, where the Fox sisters first heard spirit rapping, was dismantled and moved to Lilydale in 1916. Unfortunately, it burned to the ground in 1955. On the site there today is a memorial to the Fox sisters and a meditation garden. Lilydale remains the home for mediumship and spiritual healing. Their website lists a number of events each summer and lists 35 mediums in residence, each with a website. I will close with one last story. In 1904, before the Fox house was moved, it stood as a spook house in Hydesville. Children would play around it, and one day some ventured into the basement. A crumbling wall gave way, and guess what they found? A skeleton lay behind the wall. The coroner said it was approximately 50 years old. Was it the murdered peddler who first communicated with Maggie and Kate in 1848? Only the spirits know. Thank you all.